Okay, so I wanted one of the sets of notes this week just to kind of briefly cover some of the writers that we're looking at this semester and just to give you a little background on them before you approach their poetry, their prose, and some of the stories that you're going to look at. So, no matter if we're looking at the quote unquote classic authors for this week, or if we're looking at the Donlin Voices authors, I want you to think about what obstacles did women face in trying to write to get published then and now. You might find some similarities between that. You might also want to look at how certain themes reoccur or reappear in different mediums. Some things that were pointed out in the first set of readings that we did for this week on both parts were equality, marriage, motherhood, mother-daughter relations, independence of all kind, beauty. Many of you mentioned with the collection of Darlin Voices, a lot of relations with social awareness, with immigration, with a lot of translatable themes that you felt like could span many, many different times. One author that we're going to look at this week is Annie Adams Fields. And I can tell you that very rarely do people actually even hear of her unless they hear of the author Sarah Orne Jewett, which I know some of you have heard of her before in American literature. So among her writings are different collections of poetry and essays, as well as memoirs, and she was also known for writing biographies of her literary acquaintances, her literary friends. She was super involved in charity work and philanthropic work, and that's where she found a lot of her pleasure in her lifetime. But her later years were spent as a companion to Sarah Orne Jewett. So typically, when you see Sarah Orne Jewett, you see Annie Adams Field's name and sort of them kind of bunched together a little bit more. But I wanted to look at her separately because we often don't look at her separately. When she married James Thomas Fields in 1854, she was his second wife. His first wife was a cousin of hers, not uncommon for this time period. He was very well established in the publishing business, and so with him, he very much encouraged and uh, enjoyed her companionship as an equal, and she encouraged him to, sign and interview and spend time with up and coming writers, especially women writers. So Sarah Orne Jewett, Mary Eleanor Wilkins Freeman, who's another New England based author, Emma Lazarus, who many of you had read her poetry and her writing, The New Colossus, which is the poem that's on the base of the Statue of Liberty. She was also, equally at home with a lot of established figures, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, two New England established writers. And she compiled Harriet Beecher Stowe's biography. At their home in Boston, they had what was sort of referred to as a literary saloon where authors would come, they would gather, they would be together, they would talk about their writing and so forth, and just be in a really social space. But as I mentioned, she was really big into her nonprofit and charity work, and she was also really big as a social reformer of this time period. So, two things really importantly, she founded the Holly Tree Inns, which were these coffee houses that served inexpensive and nutritious meals, and then the Lincoln Street home, which ended up being a safe and very inexpensive residence for unmarried working women at this time, which is really, really important because there's not many places that unmarried working women can go. The other parts of her contributions, well, over her life, her husband dies in 1881. She still takes on this role of being really important in Boston literary life. A lot of her work is the sympathetic understanding of her friends, and a lot of her friends happen to be really important people. And as I mentioned, her closest friend was Sarah Orne Jewett. We're going to be reading some of Jewett's short stories during our semester here, but she also did write some novels. Some of you have read The White Heron before, and that's one of her most famous ones. So, in the winter of 1881 and 1882, Jewett would spend that time with Fields at her Boston home, especially after her husband's death. And then from there on, they also shared their homes with one another for about half of the year. They traveled together as companions. They met different European authors and continued to do that during the course of their life together. She ends up passing away in 1915. She's buried alongside her husband, and her literary importance pretty much lies in two areas. The influence that she had over her husband, um, especially in how she really influenced what works he picked to be published by Ticknor and Fields, which was a major, major publishing house at the time. He truly valued her judgment as reflecting a woman's point of view and really felt like she knew what a woman's audience wanted at this time period. That might seem kind of trivial, but that's actually really, really important to think about. Field also is really important, as I mentioned, not only in her own writing, but editing different collections. She edited both her husband's sketches and letters, other New England writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe, Celia Thaxter, Sarah Orne-Jouette's letter collection. And it's not to say these are necessarily critical or scholarly works, but they really help someone who's doing primary research on these authors. Her book, Authors and Friends, which came out in 1896, is a whole series of sketches. Um, and her diaries still remain unpublished, except for certain excerpts, which is really interesting. And you can see these are some of I know some of these authors' names are going to sound really familiar to you, with whom she and her husband were friends with. But she herself remains a kind of puzzling figure. Her writings have these traditional orientation toward sentimentality and the true cult of womanhood. You know, this is what a woman should be like and adhere to. Yet, on the other side, she was pretty liberal in that she was a supporter of women's emancipation. Her relationship, her association with Sarah Orne-Jouette and a lot of other people has a lot less of that traditional side. She and Sarah Orne-Jouette were even in what some would call a Boston marriage, where they were partners, sort of like unsaid partners at the time period, and that they were always at each other's side and at each other's companions. So I picked poetry for Annie Adams Fields for us to look at. You'll see those poems on our Canvas site, and those are some that you're going to annotate. These are some of my favorite ones here. I do really love the imagery in her poems. I like the repetition. In some instances, you will see some traditional rhyme schemes, but I also really appreciate the simplicity of her works too, particularly in a lot of her poems that kind of reflect the changing attitudes of life, changing attitudes of the seasons, and so forth. So I picked a couple, but I'm hoping that you'll find a couple that you also like too, and that we can also kind of bring those together to look. But I really wanted to study her because I think she's especially in some cases overlooked for her own writing and only kind of seen as just a companion of some sorts to both her husband and Sarah Orne-Jouette. The other writer for this week is who we call her Fanny Fern. Sarah Payson Willis is her name, and she is a comic writer in the 19th century when political feminism is starting to take shape. She's super quick and agile and sharp. She's very satirical, so she satirizes a lot of social conventions and pieties. So you want to look at her rhetorical style too. She asks sort of lots of questions, and she's very much a humorist rather than a sentimental writer. So she's kind of the opposite of Annie Adams Fields or Anne Bradstreet. I put this here. She knows her audience. She is writing for middle class female readers and what mattered to them. By 1855, she is the highest paid columnist in the United States. She gets $100 per week for her New York Ledger column, which might not seem like a lot right now, is a lot of money back then. In 1849, she was a young widow and she married a merchant who was Samuel Farrington. She knew right away the marriage was a mistake. He was so jealous of her success that she actually left him 2 years later, which was super scandalous because they formally divorced. And not that many people formally divorced at this time period. She published her first article, The Governess, in 1851, and she began using the pen name Fanny Fern for all of her articles. She had a family to support, so she began writing quite a bit. Her brother Nathaniel was really big in the publishing business. He was a magazine owner. He refused to actually publish her writing. He said it wasn't marketable. He said it wasn't any good. Clearly, he was proved wrong because everyone started publishing her works, and yeah, you can imagine probably how he felt after that. So she was very, very successful, like to actually make a living off her writing as a columnist at this time period. She fit her material and subject matter to the audience. She knew who she was writing for. Women, they were the ones who were reading these literary papers, often northern white women. She used a controversial style with interjections, lots of exclamation points, as you'll see. But at the same time, she tackles topics that really concerned the daily life of ordinary women. So her readers are wives and mothers who are worried about their kids and fashion and difficult husbands and relatives. And you can tell that sometimes they felt oppressed, depressed, or stressed. And she expresses their problems in plain language. She talks about women's suffrage. She talks about a woman's right to her children and divorce. She makes note, and even if she jokes about unfaithful husbands, she gives practical advice to women as to not put up with that. And she talks a lot about social customs that restricted women's freedom. And sometimes she simply just writes about having a bad day. And it's really nice to read that in her humorous fashion. So she's very straightforward when she writes of these subjects. She's also credited with coining the phrase, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. So one thing when you're going through some of the short pieces that we have for Fanny Fern this week, you want to look at the rights of women and the problems in the status of female authors because those are really obvious themes. You want to think about the way she emphasizes the treatment of class because it's very unusual in this time to portray domestic servants and factory workers as well as middle class women, but she does all that at once. She's not separating their experiences. Her writing is really useful to think about style and tone. I think the style is awesome. I think the tone is hilarious, but it's also one that you can find so many lessons out of. It's human, it's spontaneous, it's not boring. And of course, you're going to have critics of it. They criticize the literal foundations, the writing, the style in itself, and then they criticize, of course, the message of her works too. Um, but again, I think just so very different for this time period is really interesting to note, and just to kind of think how unusual it was for a woman to have this success as this type of writer. So I hope you enjoy the short pieces as well by Fanny Fern, and this is her again. And I've linked to a lot of different resources as well for her and Annie Adams Field as two of our more classic authors, and we can very much, talk about them in comparison with our Dawnland Voices writers as well.